All right, this section we're going to talk now all about operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is a little bit different from classical conditioning because operant conditioning now relies on our conscious awareness of our choices and the decisions that we make. So let's go ahead and jump into this here. So one of the first things we want to talk about when we start talking about operant conditioning is first this idea of the law of effect. So Thorndike proposed this idea of the law of effect, which generally states that solutions that work are going to continue to be around and be shown, and solutions that don't work are going to kind of diminish over time. And so he tested this or presented this through this idea of this cat and this puzzle box. And so the idea was that a cat was placed into a box that had some kind of puzzle or some sort of solution that needed to be addressed in order for it to get out of the box. And so over time, you can see sort of what we have here is that it might take cats longer in the beginning to figure out how to get out of the box, but as time progresses, that time decreases and cats can get out of the box faster and faster and faster. And the idea here is just simply that they've learned how to get out of the box and they recreate or they repeat the steps that allow them to escape the box, and they don't try the things that didn't work for them. So the solutions that work maintain and are used more often, and the solutions that didn't work just kind of go away over time. So what does this have to do with operant conditioning? Well, when we talk about this idea of choices and how we make these decisions to solve problems, these are conscious choices. These are choices that we are deciding to make, and we are choosing to make the choices that work and stop making the choices that don't. And so when we look at this from an operant conditioning standpoint, we can start to see how this breaks down. So when we talk about learning and reinforcing from operant conditioning, we really kind of have these four different ways of producing some type of response, right? So the way to think about this is to kind of ask yourself two questions. First, are you trying to increase the behavior that you're looking at, or are you trying to decrease the behavior? And second, are you trying to add something to the environment, or are you trying to take something away from the environment to change that behavior? And so if we look at sort of the four different ways that we have here, well, the first one we have is reinforcement, right? So if we look, we have reinforcement here, and reinforcement is the idea of increasing the frequency of behavior. So we're going to do something to increase how often the behavior occurs. On the other hand, instead, we also have punishment, and punishment acts to decrease the frequency of the behavior that's occurring. And to do that, to accomplish those goals, we can either use positive aspects, which increase or add some stimulus to the environment, or we could use negative aspects, which remove some stimuli from the environment. So we then end up with positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. And each of these things acts to do something a little bit different in terms of changing behavior. So let's kind of talk about each of these and break these down kind of and see how they each work. So let's first talk about positive and negative reinforcement, right? So remember, reinforcement is all about increasing the behavior that we want to see. And so maybe the behavior, in this first case, we'll talk about positive reinforcement first. Maybe the behavior is, that you want to have some positive response. You want to wave and say hello to a person. And so we have some antecedent, something that happens first. And so maybe we encounter some person that we know. And let's say we like the person. And so we wave to the person, we say hello, and that's our behavior. Well, positive reinforcement that might increase the chance of that behavior occurring in the future might be that the other person smiles back and waves as well. And so we are adding something, that positive aspect of them waving, and it's reinforcing that behavior of us waving and making it more likely that we'll do that again in the future. On the other hand, we have negative reinforcement. So we're still trying to increase the behavior, but now we're trying to take something away. And so maybe now we encounter a person that we know, but we don't like them, right? So they're just someone we don't really like. And so maybe we choose to hide from that person. And so avoiding them to not interact with them. And so we're taking away that interaction. We're reducing that interaction with the person. And that's increasing the likelihood that we're going to hide from them in the future because it's something bad. We don't want to interact with them and we're taking it away. So, of course, we're going to be more likely to do that behavior again in the future. So that's another example here that we have. I want to give two more examples of positive and negative reinforcement here. So another example of positive reinforcement, again, would be the idea of adding something good to increase behavior. So let's say you got all A's on your report card, and that's a good behavior. Your parents want to reinforce that behavior. So they say, well, here you get a new car because you got all A's on your report card. And so that's going to maybe make you more likely to try and do that again because maybe you'll get something else in the future. And so you're adding something good to increase the behavior. Negative reinforcement, again, on the other hand, we're taking something bad away to increase the behavior. So maybe, again, you come home with all A's on your report card and your parents say, okay, well, no curfew for, the rest of this week. And that's some positive thing that they have, that's some negative thing, curfew, that they have taken away that's more likely to increase the behavior of you doing well on your report card in the future. All right, let's look now at punishment. So both positive and negative punishment. So the goal here, the idea here, right, is that we now want to decrease the frequency of the behavior. So in this example here, again, let's say we encounter a person that we know and we like, and we wave to the person to say hello. But the other person scowls back at us, right? So they disapprove of us waving at them. Well, that's going to make it less likely for us to wave to them in the future, right? So they're adding some negative, feedback to the equation. They are scowling back, they're frowning at us, and that negative addition is going to make it less likely for us to do this behavior in the future. On the other hand, negative punishment is where we're taking something away and, again, going to reduce that behavior. So we encounter a person we know and we like, and we wave hello to that person, and the other person ignores us. So they take away that positive approval, and so that's going to make it less likely for us to try to wave to them in the future. Again, looking at the other examples that I gave, let's say you come home with, all F's on your report card. So bad behavior, your parents want to improve that. They don't want you to do that anymore. So they could either use positive punishment, where they're going to add something negative to the equation to make it less likely for you to do this again in the future. So maybe they add some curfew to your life, or maybe they, add some other type of punishment to decrease your likelihood of doing this again in the future. On the other hand, you could have negative punishment where they're taking something good away. So they say, okay, I'm going to take away the car for the weekend because I don't want you to, come home with all F's on your report card again. So they're taking something good away to reduce that behavior. So that's two examples now of punishment trying to reduce behavior, either by adding or removing something from the environment. So we can also talk about the scheduling consequences, or basically how we time or schedule these responses or these consequences to whatever we're kind of measuring. And so we kind of have this breakdown in the same way, where we create kind of these 4 different types of scheduling consequences. And so when we look at these, we have kind of 2 criteria that we can ask ourselves. First, does the reinforcer depend on, either some time interval or some number of responses? So does it vary based on how often it happens, or how many responses need to take place for some reinforcer to happen? And then we can also say, is this going to be consistent? Is it going to take place on a consistent sort of cycle, or is it going to vary and have some type of distinction or change for how often or how many times it's taking place? And so we create these 4 kind of types of scheduling that we can see. And so the first one here that we have is a fixed interval schedule. And so this is using time as a component, where it's saying every set amount of time, because it's fixed, some response or some consequence is going to be given. So that could be a positive or a negative consequence, but some consequence is going to be given at a set amount of time. So maybe that's every 10 minutes, we get some response to whatever it was that we were doing. On the other hand, we could have some variable interval. So maybe now it's not every 10 minutes. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 12 minutes, sometimes it's 10 minutes. And the gaps between those responses or those consequences vary, which kind of change how we expect those to occur. Then on the other hand, we say maybe it's not about time, but maybe it's instead about the number of responses that must be made. So maybe say you have to complete 10 of these things before you get a response. And that is going to be fixed at 10 things you have to complete every time. And that would be a fixed ratio. On the other hand, maybe that varies. So maybe sometimes you get a response for every 2 things that you do, or every 5 things that you do, or when you do this thing 10 times, you get some response or some consequence. And so that would be a variable ratio where that is changing between these 2 things. So the main things to keep in mind again is that we can separate either by how frequent we get a response or how many things we must do to get a response. And then we can also adjust based on a consistent schedule or a variable schedule where this changes over time. And what's really interesting to kind of see how this is associated with learning is kind of how we see these in effect. So what we end up seeing is that a variable ratio, so this one here, tends to be, well, the fastest and most effective way of producing responses. So we see this happen very quickly. We see that, people are going to try to get these behaviors. They're going to do the behaviors more and more because they are not sure when they're going to get a response, because it varies based on how many times they've performed this behavior. So they're going to keep trying and hope that this is the time they get a reward, or this is the time that they get some consequence or some feedback to what it is. Then, of course, we have fixed ratio, which comes in second place, and then variable interval, and then fixed interval being kind of the least effective way of learning or having that association take place. And so I just find this really interesting to kind of see and look at kind of how these break down and seeing which ones are more effective when we kind of see this take place.